Good morning, everybody. It is 5:15 in the morning. I'm getting ready to start my day at work. Thank you for tuning in, checking out the channel as always. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about exercise selection and volume intensity prescription for accessory, well, secondary and accessory movements, right? So there's two ways we can look at this, right? And this is something I always talk about. Are we looking at something through the lens of powerlifting, or are we looking at it through the lens of human performance and performance enhancement, right? So, and the two don't have to be mutually exclusive, like the two can sort of intersect. So as far as powerlifting goes, if we are looking at the selection of a secondary exercise, now there's two ways you can go about doing this within the context of powerlifting again. You can either use it acutely, meaning that like if let's say I safety squat bar squat versus chains or whatever, right? My upper back rounds. Okay, that's where my weak point is identified during the lift. You can then either use your secondary slot acutely to say, okay, my upper back is potentially weak, or I got out of the groove, so I'm gonna select an exercise that is going to specifically target that particular issue, right? So if we're talking about like upper back rounding, maybe we do like some SSB, upper back good mornings, or some SSB shrugs, or some snatch grip RDLs or something like that, right? Someone's gonna tax the upper back more aggressively. Or you can use it chronically, so acutely, very specific, versus chronic, very obtuse and very generalized. You can use your secondary slot generally and say, okay, here are things that I know I need to address. Like I need to address upper back strength and tightness. I need to address hamstring, posterior chain strength, blah, 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 right? So I'm gonna select an exercise for the next 3 to 4 weeks, or however long my cycle is, right? We're talking about programming cycle, not in cycle. Little joke, calm down. How long my wave is, you can, again, adjust, you can select that exercise for those 3 to 4 weeks, right? So again, if my upper back is weak, maybe I'm gonna do a snatch grip RDL. Okay, I'm gonna run that for 3 weeks, and you can either flat load it, you do the same volume and intensity across all 3 weeks, or you like undulate it. Really, it comes down to what you want and what you feel you need and what you respond to best. Now, in terms of tactical performance or performance enhancement from a non-powerlifting perspective, so more from a generalized perspective, I prefer to err on the side of that chronic prescription, right? So we have on a given day, let's say we have 30 people come through the gym in a session, right? I cannot and will not prescribe individual exercises or even provide a menu, because that's still too broad options for acute selection or acute prescription of secondary exercises, right? So what I mean by that is if we have 30 guys in the weight room at a given pop or at a given time, and 30 of them have different, or each of them has a different weak point. My knees cave in, my hips shoot up, my upper back caves, I lose my bracing, whatever it is, right? I don't have the bandwidth to prescribe for John Doe, G.I. Joe, and Joe Blow, right? The 3 Joes, right? I don't have the bandwidth to provide acute prescriptive exercise selection for them. So I'm gonna look at my population as a whole and not necessarily target their weak points or address like known weak points, but address things that I know they need, right? So from a tactical perspective, we need to have a strong posterior chain, right? Now that's a little bit less aggressively than like powerlifting. Like you don't need to have this like super strong, behemoth of a backside when it comes to tactical performance, but you do need to have a functional backside, like glutes, hamstrings, calves, spinal erectors, traps, all that kind of stuff, right? You need to be functional and you need to be able to have the endurance to perform your job under load and under fatigue, right? So that's another difference between powerlifting and tactical, is that powerlifting is very acute and it's very finite and precise with its application of stimulus and stressor, right? Meaning like you come in, you do a training session or you do a meet and you're done, right? Tactical, from what I understand, again, I've never been in this position, but tactical, from what I understand, it's like you infill, so you can be dropped off or you can ruck in, depends on the terrain, the mission, et cetera, right? You could swim in, you could free fall. The point is you have an infill, and then you have to operate and execute your mission, and then you have to exfil, right? So there's basically 3 different stages to each operation, again, simplified, right? But the way that I look at it is from a tactical perspective. It's like, how can I help these operators or these service members continue to perform their duties at the highest possible level while under fatigue and while under load, right? So again, that goes back to my point of what exercise am I going to select? Probably if it's a lower day, it's going to be some sort of posterior chain movement, either a good morning or an RDL variation, right? Because both of those are pretty safe. I mean, good morning, you can argue back and forth, return on investment, risk to reward ratio, all that kind of stuff, right? But it comes down to how you load it, and then that's where you can get a little bit more finite and precise. It's like if I had the 3 Joes, John Doe, G.I. Joe, and Joe Blow, let's say Joe Blow can't hinge properly in a good morning, maybe we try a seated good morning. So there's regression and progression of all things, right? And that's where you can get a little more precise and a little more individualized. Now, as far as intensity or volume and intensity prescription, excuse me, that was terrible. So the way that again, if you're returning to the channel, you should know that I use the conjugate method. So max effort, dynamic effort, repetition effort method, right? So if we're talking about a max effort lower day, let's say, right? So we work up to a top single, we get our maximal strength stimulus, and then we have our secondary and our accessory exercises after that. Now, the max effort movement, that is going to be your maximal strength development. That is where you're going to get maximally strong, increase your force production, your rate coding, all that kind of stuff, right? That's where that happens. Now, with your secondary and your tertiary or accessory exercises, you are still developing strength. But the way that I kind of look at it is like, if I'm picking a secondary exercise, like, yes, it's going to help fill the gaps in that max effort movement, right? So again, like things that I chronically, globally, universally know to be true across the population, weak upper back, weak hamstrings, fragile lower back, like all those things, I'm going to select an exercise based on addressing those 3 things. And then as far as the volume and intensity prescription, I'm going to select a volume or prescribe a volume that is high enough to sort of incite or create a hypertrophy effect, but also somewhat of a strength effect. So it's probably like that 8, maybe 10 range, depending on how you load it, right? Anything, I don't go above 10s. We all know that 10 is just sort of a globally recognized number, right? 3 sets of 10, everybody does that. We can go heavier, depending on where we are in our wave. If we're way far out from a mission and we just need to push some weight and get stronger without worrying about like, hey, I got a little dinged up. Because again, that's another difference between powerlifting and tactical, right? I can go into a competition or into a meet and I can be dinged up, right? It may suck, right? I may not perform to my best potential, but I can be hurt, or I can be a little bit sore or tired or tweaked, and that's okay. Tactical is very different. These guys are going to get hurt in the weight room. Shit does happen, right? You are going to get sore. You are going to get a little fatigued and beat down and a little dinged up. But my job as the coach is to make sure that by the time if they know they have a mission set coming up, by the time they are getting ready to go out the door, they are fresh and ready and prepared, right? It's just like, it's not just like, but it's very similar to collegiate sports, right? There's going to be accumulation of fatigue over time, right? But I can't have a massively or acutely massive fatigue load right before a game or right before a mission, right? Because again, in powerlifting, if you're sore going into a meet, it's whatever, right? Tactical, if you're sore or messed up or hurt going into a mission, you are a liability. And you are now a hindrance to the team, right? So it's my job to make sure that I prescribe things appropriately so that we don't get into those situations, right? So again, with your secondary, you can do like a hypertrophy to strength or a strength to hypertrophy sort of rep range. And then intensity, I like to use like an RPE about 7 to 8. But again, that's for that 8 to 10 rep range, so it's very different. Sorry, my back is tight. It's very different than like the max effort movement, the max effort intensity. Now, as far as accessory exercises, again, in powerlifting, we select exercises that will specifically build or generally build a specific movement pattern, right? Or improve upon a specific motor pattern. So let's take the squat in powerlifting, right? So if I have max effort box squat, I do safety squat bar good morning for my secondary, and then I pick like, you know, I'm gonna do a core movement, a single leg movement, a posterior chain movement, like a reverse hyper, and then a hamstring specific movement. So that's like 4 exercises, 4 accessory exercises, all of which are gonna be prescribed at, again, that strength to hypertrophy, or that hypertrophy strength range, right? Again, 8 to 10 on our posterior chain work, because we need more, in my mind, well, we're getting into tactical, so we'll step away from that. But in powerlifting, again, you select exercises and you prescribe intensities in order to bring up a specific movement. So everything that I choose to do on a max effort lower day is intended to bring up my squat, right? My squat number, the value of my squat, because that's what I'm measured on when it comes to powerlifting. In tactical, it's like, okay, we have our main movement, you have your secondary movement, which we talked about, and then your accessory movements are all designed to improve upon known, globally true weak points and things that they might need to work on, right? Single leg strength, right? They're up and down all the time, they're lunging, they're stepping, they're doing whatever, right? So there's a lot of unilateral multiplanar movement when it comes to these tactical guys. Upper back strength, fatigue management, right? Under load all the time, they're always rucking, right? Especially if they're infilling. So you gotta make sure that their upper back is strong enough to handle that load over time or chronically, so it doesn't get into the neck or the lower back. We start seeing upstream or downstream issues. Hamstring strength, big time. Not only just for the strength, but also knee stability. And then core strength, right? So, so your volume prescription, again, is that like strength hypertrophy range. So again, like that 8 to 10, or if you're doing something like a band leg curl, where you're just trying to pump a bunch of volume into the muscle, push a bunch of blood, hit the muscle belly and the connective tissue. I do upwards of 100 total reps in a training session. And then intensity kind of comes down to the individual. A lot of these guys, a lot of these operators know themselves much better than I will know them, and they know what works for them. Now, they may not know acutely what works for them from like a fatigue management or like a load management perspective, rather, but they can say, hey, I know I'm tired from that max effort movement. I've got X, Y, and Z going on today. I'm gonna back it off on my accessory movements a little bit so that I'm feeling fresh so I can go do my job, right? Or you get those guys who are like, I'm gonna push and I'm gonna blast through this, right? So it just comes down to understanding the population with which you work and figuring out what, from your end as a coach, or from my end as a coach, figuring out what works best, right? There's always something that can work better, right? But it's like within the context of the situation in which you are in right now, God, I sound like president or presidential candidate Harris. If you exist within the context of the moment, that was intentional. You can start figuring out like, hey, okay, if we're doing a step up or if we're doing a lunge, 12 reps each leg is probably too much. That's too much load to incur, right? So you need to drop that down a little bit. Is the lunge pattern the appropriate pattern to select, right? And so when you start looking at selection, exercise selection, it's like, what is going to be what's going to give me my greatest return on investment, my greatest bang for buck, right? So it's like, okay, let's go back to the lunge pattern, right? We all know lunges work. They're hard, they suck, right? No one likes doing lunges, right? And it's like, from a tactical strength conditioning coach perspective, my thought process is, do we need to lunge? Maybe, maybe not. Do we need a single leg pattern? Absolutely, right? Should we get a single leg pattern with hip flexion and knee flexion? Absolutely, right? But is the lunge, like a forward lunge, is that the appropriate exercise selection? Maybe not. And why is that? Because it might aggravate dudes' knees. Like we get a lot of guys, they all jump out of planes and helicopters. They have jacked up knees and ankles, right? Jacked up lower backs. Maybe a lunge, which can become a very intense movement very quickly, depending on how you load it, isn't the appropriate exercise selection, right? Maybe a reverse lunge, which is a little bit less aggressive, or a step up, or like even a split squat, something like that, based on where you're at, might be a more appropriate exercise to select and prescribe. Same is true with upper body stuff, right? We talk a lot about max effort lower and all the lower body accessories, but the same is true with upper body. Right now, upper body you tend to recover from a little bit faster, just because your load is universally or globally not as aggressive as like a squat or a deadlift day, right? You're not benching as much as you're squatting, hopefully. But the same principles apply, right? What am I trying to do? What am I trying to achieve? And then what's the easiest and not necessarily easiest, what is the simplest way to get there, right? Where my guys incur the least amount of trauma, but the greatest amount of stimulus, right? Because that's what it comes down to, is load management again, right? Trauma versus stimulus. We have to, stimulus is traumatic, right? Training is trauma, right? But it has to be below a certain threshold in order to recover from. If we push beyond that threshold, then we start overreaching, overtraining, we get sick, we get hurt, and then we are a liability to the team. So it's my job to make sure that for what I can control, we have an appropriate selection, prescription, and management. So, yeah, that's about it for the day. I appreciate you guys checking in. I'm trying, not that it matters to anyone out there, but I'm trying to be a little more regular with this. It's just hard. So anyway, thank you for checking in. Please like, comment, subscribe, share, all that kind of stuff. And as always, don't waste the pain.